Continuing Alexander of Macedon by Harold Lamb. We are on Chapter 4, The Mountains and Thebes. Pushing rapidly through the high valleys near the summit of Mount Hamas, the Macedonian army threaded through the barbarian peoples, who watched from hiding, judging its strength suspiciously, eager to close in upon the disciplined force that restrained them from looting the lowlands. Alexander had to ride with his officers through thick forests where they might be shot down from cover. He learned that they could not expect warning. The Macedonians were among folk as merciless and unpredictable as animals. Well, humans are animals, but you know what they mean. Who could only be controlled by discipline and force. Some of them, the Highland Agrianians, volunteered to serve in the army. There were conflicts as sharp as the attack of wolf packs. Nearing one pass, the scouts in advance brought back information that the tribes in strength had barricaded themselves behind a wall of wagons, which stood at the summit of the slope, in readiness to be rolled down on the advancing column. There was no other approach to the pass. If the advance regiment scattered it, could not force the wagon wall. If it massed to attack with spears, the wagons might be launched down the slope upon it. Since Philip's son was with them, the regimental commander waited to receive an order instead of giving one. Alexander felt 500 men stolidly watch him, and knew that he could not hesitate. To halt and wait for a more advanced commander would be to admit his incompetence. So he caught at the first solution that occurred to him. Go forward as you are. If the wagons come down, divide and take shelter, and let them go through where you can. Those men who can't move out of the way should lie down and lock their shields over their backs. Let the wagons go over the shields. It amazed him, as always then, that the infantry should go forward at a word. Long experience in battle had accustomed them to facing ranks, providing their officers had weighed the situation and decided on their action. Alexander's quick imagination had taken count of all possibilities, so the men went up steadily, and the wagons crashed down from the summit, breaking the ranks and letting over the prostrate men who lay under shields and spears. They got to their feet, shaken and badly hurt, and went on. Those who could walk, Alexander never again ordered them to lie down under wagons, but he noticed the horde on the hill, terrified at seeing the decimated men moving up again, fled into the forest. By experience and by watching Parmenio and the veterans, Alexander learned how quickly decisions must be made. His commanders attacked at night. They attacked across rivers. They marched for 2 days to arrive without warning before a mountain city, like lofty Pelion, but they kept always in motion, so that no observers knew where they might be next. They pushed on where the tribes had not looked for them, to the Danube. On the barrier river, they seized only the ships within sight, some Byzantine galleys, to ferry across. I'm not terribly certain, but it's not I. There's no I in Byzantine galleys to ferry across the force in darkness. Going with them, Alexander made his way through the fields of standing corn. Well, not the yellow thing, but kernels and that hid the men, picking his way by the stars, shivering with the damp and chill and the weariness of anxiety, until they came to a wooden wall of a sleeping of a sleeping city at sunrise, and the inhabitants thought it a miracle that men in armor should be posted around them at the first sight. Bearded Celtic chieftains in leather riding breeches, with hair plaited over their shoulders, came out with gold bowls and the jewelry of their wives as gifts to the soldiers, saying that they brought tribute to the king of the Macedonians because they were afraid. Of what? Alexander laughed. Of only one thing. What is that? He felt proud that they should fear him, being young. That the sky might fall on us. To Hephaestion, they said. They seem to be brave, yet they are great boasters. Most men are boasters, Hephaestion assured him, and few enough have any courage for business like this. Alexander remembered how his father had said the same thing in the reaction after Kavranaa. Fear itself could not be driven from the mind, and Philip had been terrified. Besides, for the lives of his men, Philip had guarded his peasantry jealously, scheming to get every possible advantage for them before risking them in action. Philip had shunned fortification and the uncertain sea, plotting, deceiving, breaking his promises to win an objective without an engagement at close quarters. How he accomplished this was a mystery to every commander except Parmenio and the chief of staff, while understanding Philip's methods could not get the same result from them. This mystery of supreme command was as baffling in its way as the science of the evolution of life that Aristotle had solved. In two respects, their grasp of higher knowledge and their reliance upon reality in its minutest forms, Aristotle and Philip had reasoned alike. Otherwise, they differed sharply, for Philip acted upon intuition that was close to genius, while the Stagirite would reach a conclusion only when evidence had pointed it out. Alexander brooded over this problem of leadership with his immense persistence. By watching the veteran Parmenio, he learned only to expedients and tricks. This master of the staff could move his brigades from place to place with inimitable ease to gain some specific advantage. Beyond that, he trusted to the discipline and experience of the Macedonian soldiery to profit from the advantage. One-eyed Antigonus, caustic and conceited, had Philip's gift of deception. By terrifying an enemy, by bribing a political figure, or by coaxing his antagonists upon a stage for peaceful negotiation, Antigonus prepared a way for a sudden massacre of any force that opposed him. "Don't march up to M," he growled. "Don't be fool enough to parade your strength and intentions beforehand. Get hold of a few of them. Slice the guts of those, and the other thousands will stampede like a herd of cattle. When you have them running, you can execute all you need. That's the thing. Strike a spark of terror, and the fire will do your work. The turn of a battle comes when more of the enemy are afraid of your men than yours are of them. Wait for that turn." Yet Alexander discovered that few Macedonians really trusted Antigonus. If he made a mistake in his scheming, he sometimes sacrificed a Macedonian regiment to extricate himself. Although Alexander could not ride into a danger zone without feeling weak and cold, he was able now to keep his nerves under control. So many men watched him, their own nerves taut, taking alarm or courage from his least motion, that he had to act as if he were certain of himself. So he formed the habit of leaving off his helmet. For some reason, when he did this, the men around him helmeted, feeling more at ease In the same way, to cover his own anxiety, he had a way of laughing much and talking to them. For the rest, he trusted to guessing aright as the situation around him changed and new difficulties cropped up. Distrusting his own ability, he seldom thought out beforehand what he should do, although his mind was constantly preoccupied with what might happen. By degrees, the ranks learned to watch the golden-headed youth on black Bucephalus for a sign of what he might be doing next. Alexander now mounted Bucephalus when there was prospect of any action. There's certainly etiquette for every leader and follower, right? At this time, he developed a tendency to push forward recklessly. He learned that it was safer to move quickly than to delay in the mountains. The Macedonian infantry, mountain bred, was at home in such marching, and it happened that in the Dalmatian heights he pushed his column forward blindly into a box-like valley, to find that the heights around him were held by formidable Illyrian barbarians, who promptly cut off the column's road of escape. The Illyrians remained out of reach, while other tribes hurried up to strengthen the mountain trap. Parmenio, outside the valley, with cavalry, forced his way into Alexander and managed to open an escape route back along the valley to a river where the infantry was out of danger. In spite of what men say, Hephaestion assured Alexander, "You have a mistress, and she is that slut, Taka." Taka was as their goddess of fortune. Much importuned by the soldiery, the careless Hephaestion never seemed to be disturbed in action. He said that every Macedonian had 100-to-1 chance of coming out alive. Although he might be hurt in such affairs at such odds, why should anyone worry? Alexander laughed in sheer relief. After fording the river on the black horse, with the rear guard, and watching the masses of barbarians, halt at the bank behind him, he was soaked with perspiration. "I've never seen Fortune's face. Well, they say Tucka follows you everywhere. If I had been lucky, I would like to know when." For once, Hephaestion fell serious. "If you don't know, well, you are protected in some way. Either you number the gods among you, among your ancestors, or the gods set the seal of Philip's good fortune upon you at his death. Fate, you can't argue about it. The Felix men have it all figured out. If you don't grab the best-looking girls, or lap up wine from the jug, or knock a chap down who steps on your toes, it's a sign you're something more than a plain mortal, like Hephaestion, who does all those things. So does Perdiccas, and he is a grand soldier. They don't know why you were different, but they know you were different. Why else don't they call you Highborn, or Commander, or Strawthatch, eh? Nothing of the kind. You were Alexander, and that's the sum of it." So Alexander found himself compelled by circumstances to do what he least liked to do, lead men in conflict. Tormented by his own inability and reckless as now of physical hurt, he dreaded the time when he would make some inexcusable mistake, and his companions like Hephaestion and Perdiccas would see the feet of clay in the statue they had erected themselves. Already it seemed to him that he had failed, and Macedon was breaking up. These men in the ranks saw in him only the reflection of their own ideal of a fearless and invincible leader, favored by the gods. When they discovered his weakness, they would jeer at the yellow-headed fool who acted the part of a soldier. They would tear the mask from him and laugh and bid him go back to the wailing murderess Olympias. With all his stubborn determination, he set himself to postpone that unmasking, for he knew now, except in Aristotle's academy, he would meet with no mercy in Macedon. Well, I wouldn't worry about Philip, but the other people that his mother had killed definitely might not have deserved it. Perhaps the destruction at Thebes was inevitable, but it shook Alexander, and the memory of it never left him. It developed while they were still on the Dalmatian coast. Couriers came up from the south to report that a new defense league was forming around Athens. Orators had taken the stand in Thebes, calling on the citizens to mobilize to defend their liberty and freedom of speech. At a rumor that Alexander had been killed in the Illyrian forest, the Thebans assassinated 2 Macedonian officers of the garrison left by Philip in Cadmea, or citadel of the city. Now the Macedonian garrison was holding out in the Cadmea, and the Thebans were calling on Sparta for alliance against the invaders. The Hellenic League was mobilizing against its masters. At Pella, the councilors felt the need of conciliating the Greek cities. Aristotle warned that the Hellenic cities must be won over by diplomacy, but the garrison and the Cadmea could not be sacrificed to gain delay for negotiation. The Macedonian generals started for Thebes at headlong speed, keeping to the highland roads out of observation and covering nearly 300 miles in 13 days, taking Alexander along. They went into the camp upon sacred ground at the cemetery outside Thebes. I see cemeteries as sort of a place where there's the record of spiritual life and where there's a last connection. You may have no reference of anything spiritual about somebody's choices in life or the people around them, except, the graves. A lot of people, that's all that's left. Hoping to relieve the Bautilians inside the city and to put an end to the resistance movement there before other armies could take the field against the wearied Macedonians. By selecting the cemetery for a campsite, Parmenio made clear that he was not seeking battle. Wanting time to rest his men, he sent envoys over to the city to offer the Thebans a truce if they would surrender the fortifications and release the garrison. The envoys came back looking grim. The Thebans, they reported, will give up nothing. They offer us a truce if we will surrender Parmenio and Philotas. When he rode around the city to inspect its wooden walls, raised on an earthen rampart, Alexander could think of no way out of the dilemma except a siege. Above the city rampart, he could see the square of the stone citadel where his garrison waited to be released. How would you get in there? He asked. Perdiccas absently, this brigade commander, had served with the army all the years that Alexander had been at Nysa. Any way that suits best. Perdiccas answered, occupied with his own considerations. For to the combat officer it seemed necessary only to break into the wall at one point. To Alexander, the great city with its monuments of the past and its tens of thousands of human beings presented a more complex problem. For the little after, Thebes occupied the skirmishing of outposts. Then he was startled to hear of a report that Perdiccas had gone over the wooden wall by a sudden rush close to the Attica gate near the Cadmea, and was tearing down a stretch of the wall. Alexander sent the Cretan archers and Agrianians, the least weary of his units, to support Perdiccas's brigade. By that time he arrived opposite of the point of entrance. The Macedonians had thrust deep into the streets, heading for the temple square. The supports had followed. It was soon clear that the forces inside had been looking in close fighting in the narrow streets, and Alexander, waiting irresolutely with the armored infantry outside, hung back against Parmenio's advice, unwilling to order the phalanx into the narrow entrance, uncertain about making an attempt to carry the wall elsewhere. Perdiccas was carried out badly wounded. A runner reported that the Cretan officer was dead with some 80 men, and that the Macedonians were retreating. They boiled out of the break in the wall, pressed by close-packed Theban shield infantry, and severely cut up. When the Thebans continued to pour through the break, Alexander ordered in the phalanx. When the mass of long spears came down and the phalanx front moved forward, the experienced Cretans gave way to the flanks, and the Theban wave followed on, broke against the solid wall of the phalanx. At once Alexander and his officers within the ranks of the spearmen ordered an advance. The massed infantry plowed forward through the disorganized enemy. Once in motion, the phalanx pressed on like an inexorable machine, harrowing the earth, treading underfoot what stood in its way, changing front to push through the break in the wall, into the crowded streets, to be caught there in the delirium of house-to-house fighting, breaking up into squads and scattering through the alleys and over the flat roofs. The Macedonian infantry fought its own battle, being now out of hand and beyond recall. At this point, the Macedonian garrison broke out of the beleaguered Cadmea and joined the attack. The Theban soldiery, entangled in a mob of women and children, retreated desperately towards their temple. The city wall being now deserted, other Macedonian contingents streamed in with volunteers from Phocis and Plataea, who had a few of their own to settle with the Thebans. In another hour, the streets had become runways for human herds that struggled, died, fled, and followed, suffered and ravaged. That night, Thebes burned. Next day, when the ruins could be policed and graves dug, 4,000 bodies of all kinds were counted. In a garden out of the drifting smoke, Alexander sat with the regimental commanders to hear reports. Most of the soldiers were still searching for coins or gems and herding in the prisoners. The city of 2 days before had changed into a devastated area, policed by the Macedonians and without other life of its own. Now, I certainly oppose the idea of fighting wars to gain POWs. The city of 2 days before had changed into a devastated area, policed by the Macedonians and without other life of its own. Some of the officers complimented Alexander on the timeliness of his counterattack with the infantry, the judgment he had shown in waiting until the right moment, as if he had planned, in cold calculation, to wait for what Antigonus called the turn of the battle. Alexander had made no such plan, nor could he make one now. This city could be left as it was to heal its wounds, or it could be demolished. Antigonus and most of the commanders argued for the destruction of the stronghold that had twice stood in the way of the Macedonians. To make an example of one enemy, they pointed out, would have an effect on all the other Greek cities. Alexander agreed. Among the prisoners in the garden awaiting judgment, he noticed that the least excited was a well-dressed woman, unusually lovely, with two children holding to her. She was accused of murdering an officer. The Theban woman had admitted to the murder, explaining that the officer had been a Thracian barbarian who broke into her house and used violence on her. Then, instead of leaving, the Thracian had tried to find out if she had hidden any jewelry away. She had told him yes, in the garden well, and when he had taken her there to examine the well, she had, pushing him in, and had thrown stones from the coping at him, killing him before the soldiers could come up. "Who are you?" Alexander demanded. "I am the sister of Theagenes, who held command against you at Chaeronea, and died there for the liberty of Greece." She waited unmoved to be sentenced to death. "Release her," the Macedonian ordered. "Escort her with the children out of our lines." As swiftly as he had dealt with the Theban woman, he ordered entire destruction of the great city, its buildings demolished except for the temple, the house of Pindar, and the homes of those who had befriended Philip, R himself, and the mass of the survivors sold as slaves. He would not hear any more individual cases. The annihilation of one of the member states of the Hellenic League almost before the others were aware that the Macedonian army had returned, stunned the volatile Athenians. The revolt died out before it gained headway. Athens sent envoys north, her renowned friends of Alexander, to urge that in this crisis the Greek cities look to him for leadership. Alexander needed only to ride at Corinth. They explained to be greeted as Captain General by the counselors of the Hellenic League, as Philip had been acclaimed before him. On that ride, Antigonus treated him with grudging respect. After the storming of Thebes that day, Alexander required that orders to the army be given by him alone. If mistakes were to be made, he would make them himself. In Athens, the friends of Demosthenes reproached the peace party, saying even sheep would not surrender their watchdogs to the wolves. Yet the delegates and the philosophers gathered hastily at Corinth, above the blue waters of the Gulf, made a great ceremony of Alexander's arrival, devoting their efforts to persuading him to lead the united forces of the cities in the Revanca, the attack upon Asia. Uncertain of the young Captain General's disposition, they felt the safest course was to urge him towards the glory of military conquest elsewhere. The philosophers reiterated that this had been the hope of Isocrates and of Philip himself. Once, when they were climbing the height above the theatre, they passed a man lying in a worn chlamys on a stone in a corner out of the wind. Those around Alexander mentioned to him that this was Diogenes, who liked to be alone. Going over to the hermit-like figure, Alexander stared at the sunburned cynic, who was one of the most talked of philosophers. When Diogenes stirred restlessly, he asked, "Is there anything you want?" Diogenes looked up without emotion. "Yes," he said, stand out of the sun." The others laughed, and Alexander went on without speaking. Yet he remembered how Diogenes, at the Council of Corinth, had wanted only sunlight. It was pleasant, resting by the waters of Corinth, sitting in the theatre on the hill in the warm evenings, and hearing Greek orators and statesmen urge him to play again the part of Achilles and cross the sea to Troy, to lift the torch where Philip had laid it down, to become the champion of Hellas. By now, so quickly did his moods change, he was troubled by the terror at Thebes, and blotting out of life around that temple on the hill. He felt that at Thebes he had broken into the shrine of a god, and when an exile from that city made any request of him, now he granted it. At Thebes, he had struck against something more than a human enemy, and he felt the need to make good the harm he had done. His eyes searched the crowds for the woman of Thebes. Without finding her, some of the philosophers understood clearly enough that Alexander, who had established himself so unexpectedly and rapidly in Philip's post of leadership of the new Hellenic League, had accomplished it only by brutal action, where Philip had relied on masterly persuasion. Among these was Aristotle, and I would favor diplomacy, but obviously things weren't working to achieve their ends in that way quite the same way.